Thank you so much, Dean Matthew and Dean Goldman, for those really powerful words. And I think I'd like to welcome now our next panel. So if you could make your way up to the table here. As they make their way, we're going to be starting with our first morning panel, which is the regulated and unregulated marketplace for medication abortion. And this panel will be moderated by Professor Grossman. Professor Grossman teaches and writes in the areas of food and drug law, health law, American legal history, and civil procedure at the Washington College of Law. Feel free. He is the author of Choose Your Medicine, Freedom of Therapeutic Choice in America, published in 2021, and co-author of Food and Drug Law, Cases and Materials. So thank you and welcome.
Welcome, everyone. I look forward to a day as stimulating and fascinating as yesterday. I am privileged to be moderating this panel, this very interdisciplinary panel regarding abortion medication. I'll give a brief introduction to each of the panelists, and then I'll dig in alphabetical and geographic order. We have Yvette Lindgren, who is an associate professor of law at the Yvonne Lindgren. I just want to show you that.
It's Yvonne, but I go by Yvette.
Okay. Yvette Lindgren, who's an associate professor of law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City Law School. She researches and writes at the intersection of reproductive rights and justice, constitutional law, and health law policy. Next, we have Melissa Madeira. Dr. Madeira wears a lot of hats in the abortion world. She's the founder and director of the Abortion Diary, a podcast and audio archive of abortion stories. She's an abortion story sharer and listener, an independent consultant on abortion matters, a special projects consultant for Plan C, which we'll hear more about, and a researcher on Project SANA, Self-Managed Abortion Needs Assessment. Next, we are privileged to hear today from Rachel Reboucher. She is the Dean of Temple University Beasley School of Law and the James E. Beasley Professor of Law. Rachel is a leading scholar in reproductive health law, feminist legal theory, and family law. And then we have Ushma Upadhyay. She is a professor at the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco, and a public health social scientist. And at UCSF, she is currently leading the CHAT study, which evaluates the safety, effectiveness, and acceptability of telehealth for abortion. And not my notes say incidentally, but I would say importantly, an alum of American University. I want to do some basic table setting for everyone, because we have lawyers in the room and doctors in the room and public health people in the room and other interested people in the room. And I thought we'd start with Ushma telling us just the basics about medication abortion. What is it? What are the drugs? How does it work? And so forth.
Sure. Medication abortion, as is used in the vast majority of medication abortions, consists of two medications. The first is mifepristone, which stops the pregnancy from growing and also implanting. And then also the second one, taken 24 to 48 hours later, is misoprostol. And it's usually one dose, but for people a little later in pregnancy, they may be offered 2 doses of misoprostol. It's approved by the FDA up to 10 weeks, but typically providers offer it up to 11 weeks off-label, and some are now going up to 12, and there's one telehealth provider that even goes up to 13 weeks.
Great, thank you very much. Next we turn to Rachel to give us some of the basic legal context as to how the abortion medication regime is regulated differently from most other drugs.
Sure. I just want to say thanks to the organizers. This has really been a terrific couple of days, and I'm delighted to be here. So, medication abortion and mifepristone, specifically regulated by the Food and Drug Administration in a pretty exceptional way. So, drugs that the FDA determined need their risk and risk evaluated more closely are subject to the Risk Evaluation and Management Strategy, or REMS. And mifepristone is subject to such a REMS. It can curtail who prescribes mifepristone. It can limit distribution. And until very recently, until 2020, mifepristone was subject to a pretty severe REMS of the 60 drugs. I think, stands alone as a drug that's got an incredible safety profile, has very few adverse events or effects, but yet is subject to having providers be certified, having restrictions on the length of gestation, but most importantly, of the various restrictions, until 2020, patients had to pick up mifepristone along with misoprostol at a healthcare facility, a medical office, a clinic, usually a clinic. And there's some dispute about whether or not that's true as a matter of FDA policy, but that's what happened. In 2020, a court suspended that rule for mifepristone as an undue burden under then KC. And it did so as a pandemic protection measure, that it was an undue burden to force people to pick up a drug that they could take on their own without provider supervision. In fact, of the 20,000 drugs that the FDA regulates, mifepristone was the only one that you had to pick up at a clinic, but you could take on your own at home. Suspended that to reduce patient-provider contact. The FDA was a different FDA then, litigated that case. Ultimately, in January of 2021, the Supreme Court reinstated the rule. Then this thing called an election happened. The FDA changed leadership, and the FDA suspended the rule again in April 2021, and then permanently lifted it in December 2021. And the reason that I'm giving you this detail is because what that has ushered in, and Ushma is going to talk in more detail about this, is telehealth for abortion, entirely virtual abortion, because now mifepristone, along with misoprostol, can be mailed. There had been an investigational drug study beforehand that had really assessed the safety and the efficacy of telehealth for abortion. And in the wake of being able to mail medication abortion more broadly, virtual clinics that do counseling online and then mail medication abortion to patients have proliferated. So there's really a seismic shift happening right now, along with the decision of the FDA to allow certified pharmacies, and we can talk about the certification process in a little bit, to dispense medication abortion.
Before we dig in further, I just want to give everybody a sense of the litigation landscape, because there's a lot going on in the courts in America now. And I'm going to tell you the three leading cases. It was two until yesterday, now it's three, and there are some others as well. The first one is in the North District of Texas in Amarillo. We were all waiting with bated breath yesterday to hear whether there would be a decision. There was not. It is a suit by a group of conservative organizations trying to get a judge to basically revoke the approval of mifepristone for various technical reasons we don't have to get into now, but we can talk about more. People may have heard of the Comstock Act and Subpart H and some of those details. Just FYI, I actually co-authored an amicus brief on behalf of 19 food and drug law scholars in defense of the government in that case. The second big case is by a case by GenBioPro, which is the manufacturer of generic mifepristone. Mifepristone, by the way, is manufactured and sold by two companies, Denko, which is the pioneer company, the brand name company, as well as GenBioPro, which now sells the majority of the drug. And they have brought a suit in West Virginia saying that FDA's approval of mifepristone preempts not just state bans on mifepristone, but even broader state bans on abortion to the extent that they are alleged to extend to mifepristone. And then finally, yesterday, 12 Democratic attorneys general filed a case in the Eastern District of Washington saying that this court should revoke the REMS that Rachel was talking about that applies to mifepristone as unjustified by the science and by the statutory standards for REMS. One thing I want you to think about, because so many issues are flippable in this world, is a lot of the arguments that we made against the suit in Texas regarding telling FDA to do this or that could also be used against the Attorney General's suit in West Virginia. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic there. So let's turn to Yvette. In the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, a wide array of issues have arisen around medication abortion. What are some of the specific issues concerning this topic that have come up in your research, writing, and thinking in the past months?
You know, I've been doing a lot of research and scholarship on self-managed care. I started with an article in 2017, and my most recent piece was in Cornell Law Review in 2021, and I am so delighted that yesterday there was so much conversation around self-managed care, and that this issue is getting some more sustained attention. There's been lots of research done, especially internationally, for many years, but the conversation as to its legal underpinnings has had less attention. So I'm really glad to see it. And the things that are emerging, of course, in the issue of self-managed care, you know, it's two things. It's the increasing draconian surveillance state, and it is the criminalization, because of course it was, you know, relatively easy, as we saw with SB 8, to shut down almost overnight abortion clinics. It's much more difficult to control the movement of medication abortion over state lines, permeable state lines, and through the mails. And so that's where states that are restrictive of abortion are going to be turning their attention. And to be clear, you know, criminalization and prosecution for poor pregnancy outcomes has been happening for decades. We talked about it yesterday on panels, you know, with the 80s and the war on drugs. And so, you know, criminalization and prosecution has been happening, and it's going to continue, and it's going to continue to impact disproportionately the people who are most marginalized, people living in poverty, who are disproportionately people of color, people in violent, intimate relationships, people with compromised immigration status. It's essentially people who don't have the ability to travel out of state to get care will be pushed to self-management.
So Melissa, you're very familiar with the facts on the ground in states that have already banned abortion or virtually banned abortion. And can you talk about how people access abortion medication in a state where it's already illegal, which gives us kind of a window into what the whole country might look like in the situation where a court was to successfully ban mifepristone nationwide?
Well, first I want to begin by saying that this is like not new. People have been self-managing their abortions for a while. We've just are into like a larger conversation about it because of Dobbs and because of where things have been going, right? So people have been able to get abortion pills and are getting abortion pills online. Since I'm a historian that's really bad with dates. So I believe since 2015, Plancy has been working to get this information out into the world, and people can go online and find out information, vetted sources to be able to get pills online, and people have been doing that if they can find that information, and ordering them online from quote unquote online pharmacies. And I think we are changing the language around that because we don't want people to mistake them as actual pharmacies. They're websites that sell pills online and send them to people without any questioning about their medical state or anything like that. You want them, you order them, you pay for them, you get them in the mail, and you use them at home. And then there are, like an organization like Aid Access that since 2018 has been sending pills to every state in the US to people who need them and want them without concern about what the law is in those states. And people are able to order them and get a little bit of physician involvement, right? So in those cases, it is more of a telehealth service in which you do offer information about your healthcare background. A doctor is looking at this information, and then you can get a pharmacy. Someone in India sends them to people in the U.S. So there's those ways that people have been doing things. But then there's also like people can go across the border into Mexico and get pills and use them. And I also don't want to I don't want to fall into a pit of despair. I mean, I'm a pretty cynical person generally. I'm from New York, and but I don't like to fall into a pit of despair in these things because there are people around the world that have been living under situations in which abortion is illegal and not accessible, and they have found ways to make sure that they can support people who need abortion. And for many of those people, it is me so alone, and it has been me so alone, and it will continue to be me so alone. But so we need to get out of this notion that the MIFI and MISO are the only ways for people to get medication abortion, right? Like there are other ways, and we will figure it out. But the best way to figure it out is to look outside of ourselves, and our movement is really, really, really bad at that, very bad. So that there are more ways for people to access, right? But there are already ways for people to access, and ways that people have been doing for a very long time, and will continue to do, right? So let's not fall into like a pit of despair. We don't need to. Of course, this is terrible, but we will find ways out of it. I don't know if that answers the question. If I need to.
Well, I was born in the Bronx, so I fall
Well, it's
into
a pit
pits
of
despair
all the time. Yeah.
Ushma, can you talk a little bit more about telehealth? And you've done a lot of study on its appropriateness and effectiveness for this type of care.
Yeah. So I'll give you a little bit of background on our CHAT study. It's called the California Home Abortion by Telehealth Study, but it is actually now it has expanded to 22 states. And we tried to submit an application to get approval to do this. Our first application was in 2018, and it was denied. We submitted again, denied. We went back and forth about 8 times. And when COVID hit, we had an application in, and COVID hit, we still got another denial after that to do, and basically the main issue is that they said that it would be unacceptable for an abortion, for a telehealth abortion without an ultrasound. That's the problem. That's the issue that they had. And so after all of the regulatory changes that Rachel described, we were able to go ahead and start our study. And now we have data on 6,000 patients. I mean, many virtual clinics have propped up after the legal changes. And virtual clinics are providers that don't have a brick and mortar site. And they've proliferated. They're active in now, I think it's 24 states. And they're really doing great work in terms of expanding the model, but our preliminary evidence does show that the patient population is significantly more likely to be white compared to the sociodemographics of the national abortion-seeking population. And so we are, I do have a concern that telehealth is reaching only those people who are most advantaged, people who have access to technology and information. The other piece I was going to add is that many people don't realize is that there's asynchronous telehealth and synchronous. And asynchronous really expands options for people because they can be at work. You know, we had one patient who was, not one patient, one study participant who was an Amazon driver and was able to just pull over and do the messaging with the provider. It could be a nurse practitioner, it doesn't have to be a doctor. And they just go back and forth, answering questions, and then they get their medications in the mail. So they don't have to find childcare. They don't have to take time off of work. It's very easily integrated into their day. And that has huge implications for health equity. And what else was I going to say? The model just has expanded access. Oh, I was going to just mention how people in banned states are also using telehealth in creative ways. And some telehealth providers have actual instructions. Abortiontelemedicine.com is the one, they go up to 13 weeks. They have instructions on their website. They're bold, it's really impressive how they are trying to help. They're probably taking legal risks. At the other end of the spectrum are providers that are actually checking IP addresses of patients, and Abortion on Demand is the one. And so we have a huge variety of legal risk-taking among the telehealth providers. It's very interesting. Melissa, go ahead.
Cost is a big reason why. I mean, telehealth has expanded access, but cost is still an issue and is a big reason why the demographics are what they are, right? And luckily, something like aid access does have a sliding scale. And in the research that we did with Project Sana, cost was a major reason why people, even in a state where you could go to a clinic and get an abortion, like very close by, they ordered pills online and waited 2 weeks because they have a sliding scale, and some people didn't pay anything. Like, they'll still send you pills even if you can't afford it. So cost is a huge issue. I mean, yes, it's less than going to a brick and mortar clinic, but it's still probably half the price. Yeah, like $250.
Yeah,
$250 is about probably
in California and Washington, the average price, if you're getting a medication abortion, is about $700 to $750.
Yeah.
So $250 versus $750.
Yeah, or zero is
or zero. Zero is if a lot of. I mean, that gets into the Medicaid issues. Some states allow Medicaid coverage for telehealth, and some states do not. And so then that's another reason we're seeing health equity issues, because someone who has Medicaid is going to say, well, I can travel an hour and get a free abortion, or I can go online and have to pay $250, or go to aid access and pay $110.
I think it's 110 now, or 105, but it is a true sliding scale. If you say, I mean, the majority of the people that we spoke to, more than half of the 80 people paid less than half of what was asked of them, which was $90 at the time. And a good number of people didn't pay anything because they couldn't afford it at all. And then we're thinking about barriers, right? Like, it's not just the cost of the abortion, right? Like, if you need to pay for childcare, if you need to pay to drive there, like, that adds up. So the fact that you can go online and pay $90 or nothing is a lot more helpful to people. But you do have to wait those very excruciating 2 weeks to get those pills.
And also the legal risk.
Yes.
If I could turn to legal risk, Yvette has done a lot of thinking and research about surveillance and criminalization. And as I think we all have the experience now that every single keystroke that we do on a computer is being tracked by someone. What are your reflections on telehealth and surveillance going forward?
I mean, I know that a different panel is going to talk more specifically about digital surveillance and femtech and all of the issues around non-HIPAA compliant or organizations that don't need to be HIPAA compliant, and the fear that the data surveillance could impact criminalization. And as I said, we have some pretty good glimpses about criminalization and the way that that kind of surveillance can take place, because criminalization has been happening. And so, people who suffer poor pregnancy outcomes, and of course, people who live in poverty, statistically, we know suffer poor pregnancy outcomes disproportionately, and will be on the radar more likely because they have less access to prenatal care, because they are living the strain on their bodies from systemic racism, because they have food and housing insecurity. So lots of reasons that they might end up being put under suspicion. And also their lives are more surveilled, just in general, because of, lots of fantastic work on how social welfare systems and reliance on public health versus, publicly paid medical care versus people who have private doctors and private insurance. The lives of people who are dependent on those systems, their reproductive lives are more surveilled and they are more pathologized. And so we see that surveillance can come in lots of forms, not just in femtech and digital forms. For people who have apps, but for example, in Purvi Patel's prosecution, her case was raised yesterday. They introduced evidence of a Google search for medication abortion for self-managed care. Lizette Herrera in Texas after SB 8 she was turned in to police by a nurse that was taking care of her at the hospital when she went to seek care. So there is lots of ways that already we're seeing surveillance occurring. But there are also ways that surveillance can be ramped up. And as I said, states that are restricting abortion are seeking to lock down that flow of medication abortion across state lines and through the mail, are going to turn, I believe, to increasingly draconian measures. And I'll give you one. In 2015, an Ohio legislator introduced a bill that required all miscarriages to be registered with the state, and that would extend or that would treat any fetal death with human involvement that came from the investigation by the state as murder, subject to not only imprisonment but the death penalty. Virginia in 2009 introduced a similar miscarriage registration requirement that all miscarriages would have to be registered with a healthcare provider. And so, this is not outside the realm of possibility. So we're seeing that not only can digital apps track and sort of give evidence of self-management, but just being poor, having a poor health pregnancy outcome, and maybe having, as Liz Kukura's recent work is showing, maybe having ambivalence about pregnancy might put you on the radar as someone who has had a human involvement with your pregnancy loss.
Rachel, are there ways that the REMS, even in its relaxed state, make the surveillance and lack of privacy issue worse?
Well, certainly certification for providers that providers attest to being able to assess gestational age, diagnose a ectopic pregnancy, be able to provide emergency care or have a plan to do so. You know, that's how one gets certified, and you attest these things to the drug manufacturer, and that creates a list that is confidential of providers of abortion in the country. But, you know, that there's been longstanding fear that that list could become public, and we know that, you know, David Cohen's fantastic work on the harassment and violence against providers creates a real risk and a real sense of stigma. And, you know, those three elements of certification don't seem like they are that onerous, but any administrative hurdle and creating this administrative hurdle and setting abortion providers apart from other healthcare professionals is something that the FDA could lift, because truly it's not necessary. Pharmacy certification, though the headlines made it seem like, you know, there would be vending machines in pharmacies doling out Miffy and Miso, that is totally unnecessary. That, you know, the tracking of shipments and recording patient in patient files and the kind of administrative burdens that will go along with pharmacy certification, you know, the FDA really could try to make the implementation of that certification as easy as possible. I'm heartened that CVS, well, I mean, I guess you know what I think about the issue, but you know, CVS and Walgreens have said that they are going to seek certification. We'll see. But they may limit that to stores in which they already have these certification processes in place for other drugs. And so, yeah, these REMS, these requirements and these restrictions, the FDA could do a lot to lift them and treat mifepristone like the incredibly safe drug that it is.
So I was going to call on you in a sec. So go ahead, and then I'll have it
Add something really quick. One of the other three that gets very little attention is the patient agreement form. And this is a form where both the patient and the provider has to sign it. And it's just a list of all of the risks of the medication. I mean, it's all information that you would get from the label or, you know, from the packaging. No other medication do you actually have to like sign. And there's something, I'm interested in what lawyers think, but it's almost like saying, okay, you better sign this and know that I'm not responsible. The government, no one's responsible if you need emergency care. And there's something a little unsettling about that.
And it's a great example. I mean, we tend to go to certification, but the patient agreement form is just totally duplicative of informed consent processes that every provider uses to talk to patients about the very small risk associated with medication abortion.
So I want to make an observation to hammer in something here, which is the abortion medication regime is 2 drugs. One of the drugs is treated very differently from the other drug. The REMS only applies to mifepristone. But we're in a weird situation because misoprostol itself has not been approved for abortion, certainly as a sole treatment. Its labeling was not changed. It has only been approved indirectly by its inclusion in the approval of mifepristone as part of the regimen. This is known as cross-labeling. And so given the fact that these 2 drugs are being treated differently, and the fact that some of the litigation is going after mifepristone in particular, I'd love to hear from you, Ushma, a little bit about the efficacy of misoprostol alone.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about it yesterday. It is highly effective. A lot of clinicians, I would say, are hesitant to provide miso alone because they're looking at older studies. But the newer studies, one of which was led by Caitlin Gertz, Dr. Caitlin Gertz here, shows much higher efficacy rates. So the efficacy rate I usually use is 93%. Using the protocol, the latest protocol, we're about to publish a recommended protocol, which is either 3 or, well, you don't need to know the exact, oh, say it? All right, so it's either 3 or 4 doses of misoprostol taken 3 hours apart, either sublingually or vaginally. And so the clinician has discretion between 3 or 4 based on how far the patient traveled to get there, plus 1 additional dose to have on hand in case the first 3 or 4 doses did not result in a complete abortion because of that slightly lower effectiveness rate. And so the idea is they take more, they take more meso, it causes more cramping. And as I mentioned yesterday, the longer that one waits to intervene with a procedural abortion, the higher the effectiveness. So it just needs a little bit of time, and it also does cause greater amounts of side effects, more prolonged over time.
And law and medicine kind of conflict a little bit here in a way that you told me about yesterday. Talk about taking it sublingually versus vaginally and its implications for surveillance.
Yes, so we had some disagreement in the protocol about whether we could actually say that if the medications are inserted vaginally, there may be some remnants that can be detected if the person has a vaginal exam. And so we didn't come out, I think there was some legal concerns about including that advice. I think some of us were really advocating to keep it in, and the ultimate decision was to say, I don't know, very little about it. Yeah.
I just have to chime in really quick and say that the organizers were just so forward-thinking, innovative in bringing together lawyers, legal academics, and public health researchers, public health academics, and particularly the incredible work of Answer and UCFM and Ushma's work in particular. And I have to just say this publicly because I'm starstruck by what they have accomplished. So, thank you. That was just gratuitous.
Thank you.
Put on record.
Definitely team efforts at Answer.
Yvette, did you
Yeah,
have
I just want to echo, this idea of it being sublingual, and being less detectable. And that, it mimics a miscarriage. If someone goes into the hospital thinking, I think things went badly with my, self-managed abortion, it will mimic a miscarriage. And so, one of the things that I keep thinking about, and I would love to hear from you, Melissa, if you have some thoughts on it, but is how to get the information out. I've seen early, an early small video that was, basically there were no words. It could be used in any language, and it was just how to take it, with the visuals of put the pills under your tongue, but how to get the word out about, if this happens, and you go to the emergency room, you do not need to say that you've self-managed your abortion. It will be treated exactly the same way, and that you should take it sublingually to fly under the radar.
Melissa?
Just say that. This is the problem, right? The information needs to be out there. We can't be afraid to put it in writing, to put it on the internet, to say it to people. This is how things become problematic, right? And one of the important things is not enough information is out there, not enough information has been out there, and people spend a lot of time looking for information and wasting time before they get the information that they need, and we need to spend a lot more time thinking about how we're going to do this so that people know what they need before they even need it, and know not to tell anybody at an emergency room. First of all, know what to expect. So I have been talking to people about their medication abortion experiences for a decade, and know that even if you go to a clinic, you go home and you still don't know what to expect. And people are still freaking out because they just don't know what's going to happen to them physically. They don't know what emotions are going to come up. These are things we can't be afraid to talk about. So, and we're at level 0. So I think finally people are let's talk about self-managed abortion. This is a conversation we should have been having a long time ago. Many of us have, but a lot of people have been too afraid to have this conversation in the movement, or have been sort of like, no, 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 we don't want to do that, and we need to get over that. So like the information has not been out there. And so I lost my train of thought. That, that like, you know, we just can't be afraid to talk about these things, and we can't be afraid to say the things that need to be said. So we are starting at 0. We're starting at like 1, what is medication abortion? What's going to happen to you when you have a medication abortion? Because the fact of the matter is that most people don't know that you can get pills to have an abortion. So before we even talk about self-managing an abortion with pills, we need to talk to people about the fact that they can have an abortion with pills. And then we need to give them all the information so that they can make the right choices for themselves. And that is actually super important, that I want to say, like, our movement is super patriarchal, and it's so frustrating. Like, all we need to do is give people all the information, lawyers out there, about risk. We need to give people all the information about what a medication abortion is so that they can decide if that's right for them. And then we need to send them out to make the right choices for them and decide if I'm going to order these pills on the internet and use this at home, or if I'm going to drive to a clinic and get it that way. But like those are their choices to make. And I want us to really, really, really think about that.
Well, listen, states where abortion is banned or virtually banned, is there a differential ability to access mifepristone versus misoprostol, or is obtaining the whole regimen as easy as obtaining either one individually?
Well, obtaining the regimen online is, I mean, I don't want to use the word easy, but it's easy. If you know how to do it, if you know to go on the internet and order the pills, and you're going to get a pack that has both Miffy and miso. So it's not like, I mean, some people could get miso alone, but most people are getting these packs on the internet, right? From either quote-unquote pharmacies, but really they're websites that sell pills online, or from, if they're going to go out to telehealth services and do like mail forwarding, which again, information that we need to be able to get out there to people, like, yes, do mail forwarding. Don't tell the clinician that you live in Texas or wherever else, and like really only offer the information that's necessary. But most people don't know that. And most clinicians, as Dushma was saying, are really open to letting people use this mail forwarding and being able to get the pills online, except for that one that we will name, Abortion on Demand. And like, it sucks when people tell you something you don't want to know, and then now you can't send them those pills, right? So, so like, I don't know if I answered the question, actually. I get on tangents. Yeah.
But I think this is a great moment for people thinking creatively about how to get information out there. So you have groups like Mayday Health that are really investing in telling people about mail forwarding and billboards and alliances that didn't exist before Dobbs in the same way or configuration that they exist now.
Yeah, because people were like, we don't want to talk about that. Now they're like, oh, we need to. But there have been people who've been doing this since before, and have this information on the internet. The question is, do people know about those resources? And the answer is no.
I'll add, be creative, but also be bold
Yes.
and courageous. I think I think everyone is obsessed with legal risk, so much to the point that they are like shooting themselves in the foot. Like,
yeah.
and and maybe calling upon the legal scholars in the room to encourage your colleagues to be bold. And also encouraging clinicians to be bold. We need, I said this yesterday, sorry, but we need our Rebecca Gomperts. We need our or not just one, we need physicians and nurse practitioners and all clinicians to come together and be bold and decide that if the Texas case comes down, FDA doesn't rule us. We're governed by our license, which is ruled by my state, my very progressive state. So I'm going to continue offering mifepristone. Why not? Or, let's see what happens, because the FDA doesn't govern physician practice.
I would also say, as people in this movement space, we bold and radical, and we have not been either bold or radical in doing our work, and we need to step outside of our comfortable boxes. I mean, not talking about me, I'm talking about a lot of other people. I use the we, but we need to step outside of our boxes and be radical, and also have the conversations that we need to be having about where we want this to go, which is, for a lot of us, demedicalization, right? We want people to be able to freely, easily access abortion pills, and so even get out of this, some of these questions that are we're still really easy conversations to have. We need to have the larger conversations about what we really want for medication abortion and where we want it to go, and not be afraid to have them. Yeah.
And Rachel, you were going to say something?
Well, I feel like lawyers are getting kind of a hard time in this panel. But no, I do think, look, I've been on TV talking about an abortion robot that will dispense medication abortion. And I joke, but, David Cohen, Greer Donnelly, myself, we have been invested in a set of scholarly projects that we are hoping communicate a bold message, and one that we hope that people take preemption arguments seriously, which we can talk about, that you could describe further as part of the West Virginia lawsuit. We've been advocating for changes in telehealth policies, so not just Medicaid reimbursement, but also thinking about the thorny issues of how telehealth, licensure, and discipline intersect, especially in states that are passing shield laws that want to protect providers that are providing legal care within their states. We've been talking about pharmacy prescribing, that states could allow pharmacies to prescribe medication abortion. And I'm not trying to take all credit here, but I in defense of lawyers and defense of legal academics, I do think that the movement has been flat-footed. I think that the movement has been reactive, but I think that there are voices that are new, and there are voices that have been saying for a long time. I put Reva Siegel and Radhika Rao in this category. Hey, the right's reasons. The right has long thrown everything against the wall to see what sticks. It has used concepts like dignity and equality to its own ends. And now it's time for us to be forward-thinking and similarly innovative in the arguments that we're using short-term and long-term. And so, I'm hopeful that this conference is just such an example of people coming together to say, what are we going to do in Texas? But what are we going to do long-term? How are we going to overturn Dobbs? How are we going to rewrite history? How are we going to think differently about on-the-ground access?
And, it may be that lawyers have a certain failure of imagination because we are working within pre-established legal presumptions. But I think that there are very bold solutions imaginable within the legal system. So when I think of the vision that you are discussing, it's not a black market of abortion medication. It is over-the-counter abortion medication.
Yes.
And,
Vending machines at the airport. I mean, I was just finally, we haven't traveled for a long time, and I was at the airport, and there was Plan B in the airport vending machine, and I was like, that's where I want to see some medication.
And so, in fact, I'm writing an article now about imagining how FDA could take the steps eventually to make abortion an OTC drug, and how it would not be inconsistent with its other OTC switches over time.
And past the first trimester, this is the conversation we also need to have.
Well, you could change the label. The FDA could change the label. It could approve medication abortion through 12 weeks. We need to think creatively about arguments. So demedicalization, I think that Maya's work on medicalization shows that you can use these concepts in different ways to promote social justice agendas. But at the root of it is something that you said that really resonates with me, is this has to be a redistribution of resources project at its core and at its base, is to think about how we are going to shore up these deep, deep inequalities that characterize the entirety of our healthcare system.
I wanted to just, describe that something that Tracy Weed said yesterday, and that has been core to Reva Siegel's work. But this idea that we have normalized abortion as being within the purview of the medical establishment is one that it is of relatively recent origin, so that this call for bringing medication abortion and self-managed care back to the beginning, which is that before doctors stepped in, as a project, as Reva Siegel has described, which was a project of sort of the professionalization movement, birth and abortion were solely in the hands of women. So, this idea is not so radical to get rid of the gatekeeper. And Tracy Weeds talked about, that we've normalized something that we can challenge that assumption. And so, I've been thinking about, and reading about the adoption of RU486 in emergency contraception, and in the battle in France to get it approved as a drug. I cannot remember if it was the Minister of Health, or if it was it must have been the Minister of Health, described that it is the moral property of women. And I think we should be thinking that way now. I mean, this is something that we need to have direct access, over-the-counter, prophylactic distribution. I think there should be prophylactic distribution at sort of every time you go in for your annual exam. You get some medication abortion along with your prescription samples, so that it is literally everywhere.
But even with a provider, we're still doing this alone. It's not like the provider is at home with you. You're going in, you're taking one pill, and then they send you off. So why is this idea of the provider and this gatekeeping such in people's minds as like the way it needs to happen? It's not. And people were doing this alone anyway, and coming out fine. So
And there is a broader vision of a completely over-the-counter reproductive health armamentarium. That's a word that pharmacists, historians sometimes use. But Plan B is now over-the-counter after a huge fight. Oral contraceptives are now being considered the single hormone oral contraceptive. There is currently an application for for a switch to over-the-counter status in front of FDA. They delayed their advisory committee, but it looks like that's heading toward probable approval. I don't want to be overly optimistic. There's also the possibility of a multiple hormone drug you don't think so?
Oh, no, it's just very unclear when the FDA will
yes.
actually schedule the meeting. And
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that you're optimistic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one reason I am optimistic is that, coincidentally or not, FDA has proposed a new status that nobody's paying any attention to, which is over-the-counter with added conditions for safe use, which would, for all practical purposes, make it over-the-counter, although there would still be problems maybe with surveillance and so forth. It would also allow any drug approved under that to be sold simultaneously as a prescription drug and an over-the-counter drug at the same time, which would address reimbursement issues for people who rely on it being a prescription drug in order to get reimbursed. And so that's part of my optimism, not optimism in terms of speed necessarily, but I imagine a world in which that entire set of reproductive health drugs were just available over the counter. It's not beyond imagination. So we are at the end of our discussion. And I want to open up the floor to questions. Yes.
so much, Paul. This was a delight to start this morning. And I will use a mic when it is.
So that our online audience.
Hello, everyone online. This was a real delight. Thank you all for this incredibly wonderful way to start a Saturday. My question actually is for you, Louis. I know. I also am surprised. This is a question actually about the over-the-counter vision that you are sort of speaking through a legal academic frame. I say that Dan Grossman, a colleague of Ushma Padier, is at the end of a 5-year study pursuing the evidence base for exactly that. And my question for you is, how do you see the legal argument, the FDA work, and the pharmaceutical entities interacting to pursue this vision from your vantage point as someone that studies this?
So who were the three entities?
The researchers, you, yeah, and
I'm an entity?
Yeah, you're an entity, and pharma.
Well, the researchers are incredibly important, and in fact, Ushma and I were having a discussion yesterday where I was talking to her and others about, are there any actual risks that would need to be addressed and couldn't be addressed through labeling? And the people at UCSF have so much to add with respect to building that evidentiary base. Now, here's the trick, which is that a switch requires data. And it's not something that FDA just does because it feels like it should be over the counter. And so the researcher's role is absolutely indispensable in building that data set. And then what I would argue is that the way the law is currently written now is it underemphasizes, or in fact ignores literally, the benefits of access and focuses only on the risks of access, the added risks of over-the-counter without professional supervision. And FDA has, for a long time, without really doing it in an organized way or a systematic way, taken into account the benefits of access. See Plan B, by the way, where despite the political interference, the medical officers and the reviewers at FDA were all on board the entire time. And so I'm going to urge that the benefits of access, and maybe even that the statute should be revised to make clear that the benefits of access should be taken into account when you're doing an OTC switch.
Could I just put on the table too something that outside of OTC, or maybe in tandem with seeking over-the-counter access, just for our discussion, Yvette alluded to it in advanced provision of medication abortion, but also the project that is the missed period pills project, and that under abortion statutes and how abortion is defined, prescribing medication abortion to bring down the Mincies. Justice Alito, I'm there, take me back. Would not have the intent to terminate a pregnancy. And to Melissa's point, this is not new. It's not new. It's menstrual regulation. It happens all over the world. And so I want to add that to our conversation as well as we think about the regulatory framework and how it could change.
I think there was a question over here.
Yes. So this is.
Get the mic,
Oh,
sorry.
sorry.
I have to.
Visions of Phil Donahue.
Sorry. Thank you for a wonderful panel. And my question is, so, I don't know food and drug law, and so I am sitting here thinking, so how should we all react when Judge Kaczmarek hands down his opinion? In other words, we have all been whipped into a frenzy, and of course, I know from my just healthcare law background, the point that one of you made, that doctors are going to be doctors, they're going to practice medicine, but as a practical matter, what happens what are the next steps? I think, for the room, it would be helpful to understand. He issues a declaration that that MIFA cannot be, was not lawfully approved. And then what should we expect to see? It would be helpful to spend some time on what should we expect to see legally, and as a practical matter, will any of what you're doing change? You've basically said no, but I think it's good to spend a couple of minutes just drilling down on that.
Okay, so although I'm involved in the case, I don't want to dominate the Q&A here, and I'm sure that some of my colleagues have reflections on that as well.
So the FDA has broad enforcement discretion. It create a safe harbor and choose not to enforce the ruling against Danco or, well, not Danco, but Gen Biopro, who's not subject to the suit. We talked about MISO only, but more importantly, I think that this is something that we were talking about a lot last night, which is the idea that we have this message that this court is going to just obliterate MIFI is, I think, wrong-headed, because there is a lot that can happen at the level of the FDA and at the level of clinical provision that would undermine that court's decision, which has limited scope, has limited reach. So I think it's important to say here and publicly that that court in Texas is not going to be able to control the access to mifepristone, and that's something that the FDA needs to hear too, in thinking about how it responds to a decision that seeks to take it off the market. Oh, go ahead. Well, the worry about what happens on appeal is a real one. That's a real worry. And it's a real worry what happens in the Fifth Circuit. I'm getting a lot of eye contact. But I don't want this case to go before the Supreme Court. I do not want the case to go before the Supreme Court, and I think that there are going to be actions taken in other courts that contest how the judgment applies and what the FDA's power is to enforce or to use its enforcement discretion. And for me, and I'm now just speaking a little bit off the cuff, I don't want the Supreme Court to hear a case that tees up the question of what the scope of the FDA's enforcement power. I really don't want that.
In the back.
Thank you all so much. I have a question for Dr. Madera, and that I really appreciate all of the specific policy and legal things we've been talking about, but I am an anthropology student at AU, and so I'm really interested in your work around oral histories and storytelling. And I think some of what this conversation can be added into is the fact that the people on the ground are also experts of their own lives. I know that you've done a really wonderful job of kind of unsettling some of our imaginaries and putting us in a context in this conversation, and recognizing the people you talk to are not a monolith, but that if there's anything that you think that's important to share with this audience about the wisdom and knowledge of the people whose stories you are an archive for.
Thank you. That's so nice. Well, first, one of the things I've been thinking about is that as a movement who talks a lot about bodily autonomy, we need to act like a movement that cares about bodily autonomy. And that means that people are the experts of their own lives and can make their own decisions. And if there's anything that I would like anybody to leave in, thinking about in this room is we can provide all the information we want. We can talk about all of this stuff all day long, but the fact of the matter is that people out there in the world have their own lives and circumstances, and they need to make the choices that are right for them. And I actually don't like to use the word choices, because like sometimes it's not a choice. There are decisions that we make based on our circumstances and what's going on in our lives. And when you talk to people about their experiences, what you hear is, no matter what is going on in the world, in my state, in my community, I still have to make the right decision for myself. And it might be something that you don't like, that you might think is risky, that you might think is wrong, that you might think is the wrong way, but it is the way that they need to do it, right? So like, and if you listen, not enough people do listen to people's actual abortion experiences. So go out there and listen to people's actual abortion experiences. And then you'll learn about how this actually happens on the ground in the world. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but if anything, I would say like, just go and listen to people and know what abortion is really like, and be better allies to all of us. Thank you.
There are a number of hands on this side. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'll be really quick. I just was curious about your thoughts about how the switch to medication abortion affects stigma. Because in some ways it's so empowering, but it's also more hidden. And I don't know if that, I'm just curious your thoughts, how this is, what it could affect stigma.
I mean, I think it's the. I was just having this conversation yesterday because I was on a call and we were talking about how do we talk about self-managed abortion. Yes, like one of the big reasons why people do this and why they have medication abortion is this idea of privacy. And yes, we want to talk about it as like that is a positive, but we also want to say like that we need to bust stigma around abortion at the same time and say that this is just like a thing that a lot of people do, and that like the privacy aspect is important, but you actually don't need to if you don't want to. But if you need it to be private, then it is. So like there is a level in which like we have to balance the conversation that we're having around self-managed abortion and medication abortion in general, because you can also stigmatize people in the way that you talk about it, right? So like it is an important way for people to do this, because for a variety of people, for a variety of reasons, people do have to keep it like secret from people around them. Like we know that, and we want people to be safe. But we also want to talk about it enough in a way that shows that there's nothing to be shamed about. There's nothing wrong with abortion. I had an abortion. Lots of people in this room have had an abortion. People in your lives have had an abortion. I felt very alone in my abortion experience. And then I found out two people, like more than a decade later, almost 2 decades later, that people who were in that experience with me, that were helping me through it, had also had abortions, and they never told me. And I felt very alone, and I didn't have to be. So we just need to talk about it more. But we also need to talk about the reasons why people self-managed in a matter-of-fact way, too. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Can I squeeze in one more question, Sonia?
Louis?
Oh, I didn't see you. I'm sorry.
I was going to say from our telehealth results, our acceptability questions, I think people are often really surprised that it's so easy when they're accessing telehealth services, especially the asynchronous. They initially say that the biggest challenge was trusting that this was a real thing and that it could be this easy. Another advantage, they were so happy that they didn't have to talk to a clinician. I mean, so many people are anticipating and have validly experienced stigma from abortion providers or clinical staff, judgment. And so many people have expressed just delight that they don't have to explain why they want an abortion or, even have a conversation. They're just very happy to fill out the form and request it. So I think it is very stigma busting.
Yeah.
A study in Norway showed that women felt very judged by their providers when they were
Yeah.
prescribed.
We found the same thing in our study, that that was a big part of choosing SMA. Like, so providers need to do better job of showing that they're actually not going to judge people and are there for them and are good allies.
Okay, let's take one more.
Thanks very much. I'm Renee Ummeling. I'm a sociologist at Yale. And my question comes from sort of interest in the language that's being used and the terminology as a way of thinking about how best to communicate the availability of medication abortion. And so, self-managed abortion and home-based abortion and medication abortion, online abortion, mail, like abortion by mail, right? Like these are all over the counter, right? So those, even just in the 5 people sitting at this table, we've just used 6 different terms, and only a couple of them specify like a pharmaceutical or pill-based means of abortion. So I'm wondering if, of those of you who are, part of this conversation about how to do this medically and legally and socially and through, communities, like how should we think about like what to actually call this in a way that communicates what it is to somebody who needs to enter something into that Google search box?
That's a great question, and one that I think deserves going a little bit over time to hear the reflections of my co-panelists.
I mean, I'll just start by saying that, people used to call it self-induced abortion. Self-managed is much more accurate and less stigmatizing. It also is, it more broadly encompasses the many ways that people, it's not only medication abortion. People use herbal remedies. People use all sorts of different ways to terminate a pregnancy. And so self-managed is a broader concept that includes medication abortion within it.
It's a problem. Self-managed abortion is a very academic term. Like some people decided that's what we're going to call it. And so that's what we in this room are calling it. But we have, like at Plan C, we've actually been spending a lot of time thinking about what language we're going to use, because it is confusing. People don't know what we're talking about, and even when like Project Sana did interviews with providers around self-managed abortion, and we had to like be very specific about what we were talking about, and that we were talking about pills and not like other ways of people using self-management, because again, there's other ways that people are doing this, and that also has to be respected in our conversations. So like it is a problem that we need to have more conversations about, but I don't think we're actually going to come up with one way of talking about this that everybody can understand. So we just need to like be able to like have conversations using different words all the time, unfortunately, I think. Yeah, and we have actually spent some time right now at Plan C talking to partners about how people in their communities are talking about self-managed abortion and the words that they use, and acknowledging that like self-managed abortion, again, is not something that people understand or use as much. Maybe they use the word abortion pills, but we're just talking about medication abortion there when we're talking about abortion pills, right? We're not actually talking about the self-management piece. So there's just a lot of room for conversation and figuring that out. We're not going to figure it out today.
I'll let Ushma have the last word, but I'm just going to make a plug for abortion pills, but there's also a Fetching Law Review article of the same name that you can find online. But I agree, it's a very complicated question, and I love the question.
If I get the last word, I'm going to say, whatever you do, please do not use the term medical abortion. Nobody understands this term, and I think it's why knowledge of this method has been so slow. So it's, I love abortion pills too.
So let's thank
What a great way to start the day, and it's a sign of a good panel when you have more questions than you can possibly get to. So I hope you can talk to the panelists. We are going to try to run the train on time, although I'm noticing our clocks are not aligned. So my iPhone says it's 10:34.
We finished on time.
Right, yeah, exactly. So I'm going to be starting at 10:45 by my iPhone. So translate it to your clocks.